The Gospel according to Mark. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle because the harvest has come." He also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Christ.
Well, I don't have any Lebanon cedars or mustard plants in my garden, but both featured really prominently in today's readings, so I looked them up because you know that Jesus and the author of the psalm picked those plants for very specific reasons because they meant something to the audience. Cedars of Lebanon and mustard plants, when you would say that to someone who is listening to that story, they would know, okay, this is what kind of plant this is. This is what this image means. And the cedars make sense. They're this really lovely metaphor for a person who belongs to God. They can live over 600 years. They can get over 100 feet tall. The wood is insect repellent and water repellent. You can build boats with it. People build fences or other landscaping stuff out of it because it won't rot. It smells really good. It doesn't, it looks beautiful. Solomon built large portions of the temple out of it. So cedars of Lebanon appear throughout the Bible and are used as images of the power and beauty of God and God's people. They're everywhere. There's so many times refers to the cedars of Lebanon. On the other hand, mustard plants don't really get more than 3 feet tall, and many species are annuals, so you have to reseed them every single year. They weren't really sure what species of mustard Jesus was referring to here, but even the big perennials are just, scrubby bushes. So it's really interesting to me that that's the plant that Jesus chooses to compare the kingdom of God to, and not these massive and ancient cedars, even though that image was already there. It was already ready. If he'd mentioned cedars of Lebanon, his audience would have known, but he chose something else. Cedars also grow from these tiny little seeds. So the metaphor of growth would have still worked. You start with this tiny seed, now you have this massive cedar, but he didn't do that. So why did he choose a much less dramatic plant? It's really domestic. It's something that grows in a garden. It's something that you have to remember to plant every year. It's definitely not something, even the perennials, it's not something that's going to stand up for hundreds of years and then be used to construct these magnificent, huge things, sailing ships and houses of worship. And I bet a lot of the people listening to the story when Jesus told it, or reading it later in Mark's gospel, encountered mustard all the time. In their gardens, in their food, many of them probably planted it and cooked with it themselves. So the kingdom maybe seems more accessible when it's compared to something that's part of your everyday life. And when that image is part of your everyday life, that also means you're going to see it and remember it a lot more frequently. So many scholars think that Mark's gospel was written around 70 AD, shortly after the destruction of the temple, but it was written to a non-Jewish audience, probably in Rome. So they would have been the followers of this tiny, tiny minority religion scattered away in teeny weeny pockets inside this huge empire. They probably felt so small and insignificant and fragile, especially because this was around the time that the temple was destroyed. So they would have seen this huge empire that surrounded them smash another faith, which was comparatively older and larger than theirs. And it was destroyed, and they were so little. They would have felt like mustard seeds next to a centuries-old cedar, those massive trees that the temple had been built out of that the empire destroyed. So if even the cedars couldn't survive, what hope do these tiny little seeds have? Even if they do survive to grow up into mustard plants, they're still so small and easily crushed. So we'll start with a seed. What can you do to make a seed grow? Almost nothing. You can clear out the weeds, you can keep it watered, but whether or not it sprouts has very little to do with you. In fact, if you try to check on it too much, if you start poking in the dirt to see if anything's going to happen, you're going to kill it. So, and it's the same thing with like water or fertilizer. If you water it too much, you'll drown it. If you put too much fertilizer, you will burn it. Too much attention will kill it. It feels counterintuitive that working as hard as possible and putting constant effort into it will actually prevent the seeds from growing. But that's what the passage says about the man who plants the seeds. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed is going to sprout and grow. He doesn't know how. All by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk and the head, and then the grain in the head. So while we're asleep, without knowing how it happens, all by itself, the seed germinates and sprouts. In my garden this year, I have a bunch of acorn squash plants. I can't remember the last time I planted acorn squash, but there they are. There's a couple in the peppers, there's some in the tomatoes. I blame the squirrels because I have not cared for these. I haven't paid attention to them. They're getting huge. I'm going to have to pull them up or they're gonna wipe out the rest of my garden. Because no one in my house even likes acorn squash except maybe me. On the other hand, there were some herbs that I planted in these little pots and I watered them, I set them in the sun and I check on them and nothing has happened. None of these things have grown. I had to go to the grocery and buy some from the racks out front because none of these seeds were sprouting. Take another look at the verses about the man sowing the seeds and then waiting and then harvesting. We often think of these seed sowing verses as being about what we do, our work and our good deeds that God will later come and harvest. That's a lot of times how we refer to it. We plant the seeds and then we see what work we've done and then God comes and judges our results. But in this passage, the person who sows the seeds is the same person who harvests them. What we're reading here is 100% the work of God. So where are we? What are we doing in this story? How do we fit in? Well, that would make us the soil or the seeds, wouldn't it? We're the place where the work of God is happening. And we're also growing and changing every day, whether we're awake or asleep, almost in spite of ourselves. We change when we don't even want to. And isn't that an incredible thought? To imagine all these beautiful things germinating and sprouting and blooming from us. Maybe we're still tiny seeds, invisible in the dark, or maybe the good that God intends for us is still and small and hard, but there's just so much life and color hidden inside, waiting to burst out. And that's sort of what we've done all this past year and a half, hasn't it? All the things that were good and life-saving for us during the pandemic have been so small and mundane, like remembering to wear a mask. It's annoying, but it's simple. There's nothing dramatic or heroic about it. Or eating dinner at home instead of going to a restaurant with friends. You never get to see if you saved anyone's life by making spaghetti at home instead of going out. But maybe you've seen those graphs or those charts showing how a virus will spread throughout a population if one person cuts it off here. That influence of all those people that they would have interacted with and infected has also been cut off. It spreads, or you can stop it here. And there's a huge influence that you're not going to see. You're not going to get a notification on your phone that says, hey, you had dinner at home. You just kept 8 people from going to the hospital. And that's what mustard plants do too. They spread and fill entire fields with these little yellow flowers. I was looking up images of mustard plants and mustard seeds, and there were just pictures of just huge areas just covered with yellow flowers. And it was beautiful. If you move mustard plants to like another continent, they become invasive species. There are like parks and forest preserves in the Midwest that will have mustard pull days, like where they just have everyone come and pull up mustard, because once it gets in an area where it's not supposed to be, it will take over and it will push out all the native species, and so you got to get rid of it. And it actually reminds me, speaking of my out of control garden, of the sunflower that we planted one summer many years ago. Margaret started it with her gammy. She planted lots and lots of seeds, and only one of them sprouted. But because my daughter planted it with her grandma, I had to let it grow. And so it was just this one sunflower, and it grew into basically a small tree. Like it was taller than me, and it had all these branches and all these flowers. And that is the only time I have ever planted a sunflower at my house. But you would not know it to see my front yard, because that sunflower got filled up with goldfinches, and those goldfinches scattered the seeds all over my garden and into some of my other gardens in the back of my house. So we ended up with sunflowers everywhere. And sometimes I thin them or I relocate them to say, oh, you're such a nice sunflower, you would go better over here. But on the whole, I like the goldfinches that show up, so I let the sunflowers grow. I've accepted my fate as having a house covered with sunflowers. And those sunflowers just pop up seemingly overnight while I'm asleep. And I don't know how they end up in all the places they do, or why they get so huge when I'm trying so hard to ignore them. And I think that's why this passage ends the way it does, without us, the readers, being given, we don't be given a moral of the story. We don't give any clear instructions on what we're supposed to do. It just says that Jesus spoke with parables as much as they could understand, and he didn't say anything without a parable, and then he only explained it when he was alone with his disciples. In an earlier section of Mark, we do get the explanation. We do get to hear what he says to his disciples, but we don't get that here. We just have to puzzle it out on our own, and it's frustrating. But maybe that's okay, because these parables are about the mystery and the promise of God's work and how we don't know why it works or how it's going to happen. But whether we're awake and aware or asleep and dreaming, we can have faith that we're going to grow and the kingdom will spread and bloom like a field of mustard plants. Thanks be to God.